When people speak about Jewish history, they often imagine a single people with a single culture, a single mindset, and a single historical experience. But the reality of history is far more complex and far more human. Jewish history, like the history of any ancient community, is actually a story of diversity, migration, adaptation, and internal differences that developed over many centuries. If we go back almost 2,000 years, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersal of Jewish populations across different lands, Jewish communities began to settle in many regions of the world. They lived in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Persia, in Spain, and later throughout Europe. Now, when a people live in different civilizations for centuries, something very natural happens. They absorb languages, customs, and cultural habits from the societies around them. Their food changes, their clothing changes, their accents change, and sometimes even the way they interpret religious traditions begins to reflect the environment in which they live. So, over time, different Jewish communities developed very distinct identities. The Jews who settled in Central and Eastern Europe developed what later came to be known as Ashkenazi culture. They spoke Yiddish, a language that mixed Hebrew with Germanic elements, and their traditions were shaped by the social realities of medieval Europe. Meanwhile, Jewish communities that lived in Spain, Portugal, and later in parts of North Africa developed what we call Sephardic culture. Their language, Ladino, carried influences from Spanish and Hebrew, and their intellectual tradition flourished during periods such as Muslim Spain, where scholarship, philosophy, and interfaith exchange were vibrant. Then there were the Jewish communities that remained in the Middle East for centuries in places like Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Persia. These communities developed what we now refer to as Mizrahi traditions. Their languages, melodies, and cultural expressions were deeply influenced by the broader Middle Eastern environment in which they lived. What is important to understand here is that these communities were all Jewish, yet their experiences of history were very different. Their daily lives were shaped by the empires, governments, and societies around them. Some lived under Muslim rule for centuries, others under Christian kingdoms, and still others in the Persian world. Each setting produced different challenges, different opportunities, and different ways of preserving identity. And this diversity also meant that Jewish communities themselves often disagreed with one another on matters of practice, leadership, and interpretation. Their scholars debated, their traditions evolved, and their identities were not frozen in time. In other words, Jewish history is not the story of a monolithic civilization, but the story of a people navigating many worlds at once. Once we recognize this diversity, many simplistic narratives about history begin to fall apart, because no community, no civilization, and no people can be reduced to a single story. And that realization alone changes the way we understand the entire history that follows. If we continue looking deeper into history, another reality begins to emerge, and that is the reality of internal debate and disagreement. Often, when people talk about religious communities, they imagine unity and harmony within them, as if everyone always believed the same things and followed the same leaders. But history teaches us something very different. Every long-standing civilization experiences intellectual debates, rival schools of thought, and struggles over authority. Jewish history is no exception. If we go back to the period before the destruction of Jerusalem in the 1st century, the Jewish world itself was filled with competing groups that interpreted religious law and tradition in very different ways. Among the most prominent of these groups were the Pharisees and the Sadducees ***. Both groups considered themselves faithful guardians of the same religious heritage, Yet their perspectives on authority, interpretation, and practice were quite distinct. The Pharisees emphasized scholarly interpretation of the law and believed that religious understanding was not limited to the written text alone, but also included oral traditions that had been passed down through generations. Their approach gave a larger role to scholars and teachers who interpreted the law for the community. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were closely connected with the priestly aristocracy associated with the temple in Jerusalem. They tended to focus more strictly on the written scripture and were skeptical of expanding authority through oral traditions. These differences were not small technical disagreements. They represented two very different visions of religious authority and community leadership. One centered on scholarly interpretation and evolving tradition, while the other emphasized priestly authority and established structures tied to the temple. And these tensions existed within the broader political environment of Roman rule over the region. When an empire governs a land, it often intensifies internal divisions because different groups respond differently to political pressure. Some cooperate with ruling powers, others resist them, and still others try to navigate a middle path. So religious disagreements were often intertwined with political realities of the time. Then, in the year 70 CE, a turning point occurred with the ** Roman destruction of the Second Temple **. The temple in Jerusalem had been the central institution of Jewish religious life for centuries. When it was destroyed, the entire structure of religious leadership was shaken. The priestly system associated with the temple lost its foundation, and the Jewish community had to reorganize itself in a completely new way. In the aftermath of this crisis, the scholarly tradition associated with the Pharisees gradually became more influential in shaping what later developed into Rabbinic Judaism. Their emphasis on study, interpretation, and portable religious practice allowed Jewish communities to maintain their identity even while living far from Jerusalem. What we learn from this chapter of history is something deeply human. Communities grow, evolve, and argue. Ideas are tested, challenged, refined, and sometimes replaced. The presence of debate is not a sign of weakness in a civilization. Rather, it is often a sign that a tradition is alive and actively engaging with its circumstances. And when we recognize these internal conversations and disagreements, we begin to see Jewish history not as a rigid structure frozen in time, but as a dynamic and evolving intellectual tradition, shaped by centuries of discussion, struggle, and reflection. Because the story of a people is rarely written in silence, it is written through debate. As history moved forward, one of the most defining realities for Jewish communities became life in diaspora. The experience of living scattered across many lands rather than concentrated in a single homeland. This reality did not emerge overnight. It unfolded gradually through a series of historical events, migrations, and political changes that reshaped the lives of Jewish communities for centuries. A major turning point occurred with the ** Roman destruction of the Second Temple ** in the year 70 CE. The temple in Jerusalem had been more than just a religious structure. It was the spiritual, cultural, and communal center of Jewish life. Pilgrims traveled there, rituals revolved around it, and religious leadership was closely tied to its existence. When the Roman Empire destroyed it after a revolt in the region, it was not merely the loss of a building. It was the loss of the central anchor of a civilization. Following this devastation, many Jews remained in the region, but large numbers gradually spread across different parts of the world. Over time, Jewish communities became firmly established in places such as North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and across Europe. In later centuries, they would also settle in parts of Central Asia and eventually the Americas. This global dispersion created what historians refer to as the Jewish diaspora. Now, living as minorities in different societies brought both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, Jewish communities often had to navigate unfamiliar political systems and cultural environments. They lived under Christian kingdoms in Europe, under Muslim empires in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, and within various other political structures. Each of these environments shaped their experiences differently. Under certain rulers and during certain periods, Jewish communities were able to participate in commerce, scholarship, and intellectual life. In some societies, they became known for contributions in fields like medicine, translation, trade, and philosophy. At other times, however, they faced restrictions, expulsions, or hostility simply because they were a minority group with a distinct religious identity. Living in diaspora also meant that Jewish religious life had to adapt in very practical ways. Without a central temple and without political sovereignty, the community gradually built new institutions that could function anywhere. Synagogues became centers of worship and learning. Scholars developed systems of legal interpretation and study that could guide communities no matter where they lived. Religious practice shifted from being centered on a single sacred place to being carried through daily life, family traditions, and communal study. Language also reflects this journey through diaspora. As Jewish communities settled in different regions, they adopted the languages of the societies around them while preserving elements of Hebrew within their religious and cultural life. This is how languages like Yiddish and Ladino emerged, blending local linguistic influences with Jewish heritage. Over generations, these communities developed unique cultural expressions while still maintaining a shared sense of identity. Music, poetry, storytelling, and legal scholarship all became ways through which Jewish identity was preserved even in lands far from the original homeland. And this long experience of living across continents shaped a people who learned how to maintain tradition while adapting to constantly changing environments. Because when a community survives not in one place but in many places at once, its story becomes not just the history of a land, but the history of resilience itself. As Jewish communities continued to live across many regions of the world, another difficult reality became part of their historical experience, and that was the recurring pattern of suspicion, discrimination, and at times open persecution. When any minority group lives among larger societies for long periods, tensions can arise sometimes because of religious differences, sometimes because of economic competition, and sometimes because of political manipulation. Jewish history, especially in parts of Europe, reflects many of these pressures. During the medieval period, Jewish communities were present in many European kingdoms. They lived in cities, worked as traders, scholars, artisans, and in some cases financiers. Yet their position was often fragile, because they were religiously distinct from the Christian majority. They were sometimes treated as outsiders regardless of how long their families had lived in a particular region. In times of stability, they might be tolerated or even valued for their contributions. But in times of crisis, they could quickly become convenient scapegoats. Throughout medieval Europe, there were moments when rulers expelled Jewish populations from their lands. In other cases, harsh restrictions were placed on where Jews could live, what professions they could pursue, or how openly they could practice their traditions. Sometimes accusations were spread that had little basis in reality, but were powerful enough to provoke fear among the general population. These myths and rumors could ignite waves of hostility that forced communities to migrate once again in search of safety. The pattern repeated itself across different regions and centuries. In some areas, Jewish communities were able to rebuild and flourish again, contributing to local economies and intellectual life. In others, they remained under constant pressure. These cycles of acceptance and rejection left deep marks on collective memory and shaped how Jewish communities understood their place in the wider world. As we move into the modern era, the political landscape of Europe changed dramatically. New ideologies began to emerge, ideas about nationalism, race, and identity that were often presented in the language of science or progress. Unfortunately, some of these theories portrayed certain groups as inherently different or inferior. In this climate, old prejudices found new forms of expression. The most tragic culmination of this hostility occurred during the 20th century under the regime of Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. During World War Roman II the systematic persecution and mass murder of Jews reached a scale the world had never witnessed before. This catastrophe, known as the Holocaust resulted in the deaths of millions of Jewish men, women, and children across Europe. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed within a few years. The Holocaust forced humanity to confront the devastating consequences of hatred when it is combined with political power and modern technology. It also became one of the defining events shaping global conversations about human rights, minority protection, and the dangers of extremist ideology. When we study these chapters of history carefully, we begin to understand how misinformation, fear, and political manipulation can slowly build an environment where injustice becomes normalized. And that realization carries an important lesson not only for understanding the past, but also for safeguarding the future. Because the moment a society allows myths and prejudice to replace truth and justice, it begins walking down a path whose consequences can be unimaginable. As we move further into the modern period of history, another major development begins to shape Jewish political thought and global discussions surrounding identity, homeland, and nationhood. For nearly 2,000 years, Jewish communities had lived primarily in diaspora, scattered across many lands and societies. During that time, they preserved their traditions, their scholarship, and their cultural identity while adapting to the political environments around them. But in the 19th century, new ideas about nationalism began to sweep across Europe, and these ideas affected many communities, including Jews. Across Europe, different ethnic and cultural groups were beginning to argue that a people with a shared language, history, or identity should also have a political homeland. This wave of nationalist thinking influenced intellectual circles, activists, and political leaders. Within some Jewish circles, the question began to arise: if many nations were striving to establish states based on shared identity, what would that mean for a people who had lived dispersed? Centuries out of these discussions emerged the political movement known as Zionism. The movement is most closely associated with figures such as Theodor Herzl who argued in the late 19th century that Jewish communities needed a homeland where they could exercise political self-determination and live without fear of persecution. Herzl and others believed that the persistent waves of discrimination and violence in parts of Europe demonstrated that assimilation alone could not guarantee long-term security. However, it is important to understand that Zionism was never a universally accepted idea among Jews themselves. In fact, from the very beginning it sparked significant debate within Jewish communities. Some religious leaders believed that the return to a homeland should occur only through divine intervention rather than political activism. Others felt that Jewish life had already become deeply rooted in many countries, and that building a new political state might create new tensions rather than solving old ones. There were also Jewish intellectuals who supported integration into the societies in which they already lived. They argued that Jews were citizens of their respective countries, and that their future should be tied to broader democratic movements rather than nationalist separation. So, within Jewish communities themselves, there were strong supporters, cautious observers, and firm critics of the Zionist idea. Despite these debates, the movement gradually gained momentum, particularly during the early 20th century. The tragedies and upheavals of that century, including the devastation of World War, Roman II, and the horrors of the Holocaust deeply affected global opinion. In the years following the war, international political decisions led to the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. The creation of Israel marked a historic turning point, but it also opened new chapters of political complexity in the region. The questions surrounding land, sovereignty, identity, and coexistence have remained deeply debated ever since. These discussions involve not only Jewish communities but also many other peoples, governments, and international institutions. Understanding this moment in history requires recognizing the many perspectives involved, the hopes that inspired the movement, the disagreements it created within Jewish communities themselves, and the far-reaching consequences it produced in global politics. Because some of the most powerful movements in history are born not from simple answers, but from questions that entire generations struggle to resolve. As we arrive at the modern era, it becomes clear that Jewish identity today cannot be understood through a single lens. After centuries of migration, debate, hardship, adaptation, and cultural development, Jewish communities in the contemporary world are incredibly diverse in their beliefs, politics, traditions, and ways of life. The long history we have discussed diaspora, internal debates, cultural diversity, persecution, and political movements has all contributed to shaping a community that is far from monolithic. Today, Jewish populations live in many parts of the world, with large communities in places such as the United States, Europe, and the state of Israel **, while smaller communities continue to exist in regions of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Each of these communities carries its own historical experiences. Some families trace their heritage back to Central and Eastern Europe, others to Spain and North Africa, and others to centuries-old communities in the Middle East. As a result, Jewish cultural expression today includes a wide range of languages, foods, music, and traditions that reflect this global journey. In the religious sphere as well, there is a wide spectrum of belief and practice. Some Jewish communities follow very traditional interpretations of religious law and maintain lifestyles centered closely around ancient practices. Others approach religion in a more flexible or symbolic way, emphasizing cultural identity rather than strict observance. Still, others identify as Jewish culturally or historically, but live largely secular lives. This range of perspectives demonstrates that Jewish identity in the modern world is shaped not only by religion but also by culture, family heritage, and historical memory. Politically, Jewish communities are also far from uniform. Within Israel itself, there are strong debates about governance, security, religion, and the future direction of the country. Different political parties represent very different visions of society. Outside Israel, Jewish communities participate in the political systems of the countries in which they live, and their views often reflect the broader diversity of those societies. These debates sometimes become particularly visible when discussions arise about the Middle East, about national identity, or about the relationship between religion and modern secular states. Within Jewish communities themselves, there are strong disagreements on these matters. Some emphasize security and national sovereignty as central concerns, while others focus more on diplomacy, coexistence, and international cooperation. And yet, despite these differences, there remains a shared awareness of historical experience, an awareness shaped by centuries of migration, resilience, scholarship, and survival. Cultural traditions, religious texts, and collective memories continue to serve as threads connecting communities that may live thousands of miles apart. In the modern world, communication and global travel have also made these connections more visible. Jewish scholars, artists, and thinkers contribute to global conversations in fields ranging from science and literature to philosophy and politics. Their contributions reflect not a single narrative, but a mosaic of experiences shaped by the long journey of history. When we step back and observe this broader picture, we begin to understand something important. Jewish history is not simply the story of one place, one idea, or one uniform community. It is the story of a people who have lived in many civilizations, adapted to many realities, and continuously debated the meaning of their identity. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of that long journey is this: the story of any people becomes truly meaningful only when we recognize its full complexity rather than reducing it to a single narrative.